Okay, we are starting with this new book that is called Sustaining the Commons by John Andrews and Marco Janssen. I know Marco Janssen a little bit because we were together in some program. So this is from the Center for Behavior Institution and the Environment at Arizona State University. Basically, both were, I think, postdocs with Eleanor Ostrom, who passed away a few years ago, and she won the Nobel Prize for Economics for her work on showing that actually the tragedy of the commons that became very popular after Hadrian's work in the 1960s is not an inevitable outcome when people share resources. So we'll look at these ideas in the book that are basically built on Eleanor Ostrom's lifelong work on how people can share resources, let's say like a pasture, a garden, a lake, whatever, and can have rules and regulations to manage sustainably the resource, shared resource, and not necessarily have the tragedy of the commons. Okay, so the first part is on the theoretical background, and the first chapter is on why study the commons under this theoretical background section. I already have the pointer up. So the key concepts we will learn here, I'm going to be very brief because the book itself is only about 175 or so pages, and we'll come to social dilemma and other concepts of analyzing and evaluating the institutions, which may take longer, but the first few chapters, theoretical backgrounds, are fairly short in terms of the definitions we have to put down. So in this chapter we will define the meaning of the term commons, discuss the challenges of sustaining the commons, introduce the tragedy of the commons concept, provide examples and a critique of the tragedy of the commons concept. Again, there's a lot of text, as usually happens in social science, and I will only pick and choose a few things, and obviously you need to go and read the book, and it's a book that's fairly short, as I said, that you can read, and there are a lot of references. These two authors themselves have done a lot of field studies where a lot of case studies and data come from. Why study the commons? Regardless of how they are managed, these examples here in this chapter show that, and the book show that the types of resources that can be defined as the commons are essential for our society. We share them, inherit them from previous generations, and create them for future generations, or often we leave behind something for the future generations, and the question is, can we exploit them without jeopardizing the potential for the future generations to exploit the same resources? The commons are therefore crucial for our wealth and happiness. How to effectively govern the commons has been a long debate in academia over the last 40 years. The traditional approaches to solving the commons problem through privatization or state regulations have been challenged. The next section will introduce the basic elements of the debate, the controversy that has arisen around it, and some alternative solutions. Okay, so why study commons? This is a good example of how things evolve in terms of commons and the issues when they are shared. So it's the question of free access versus actually sharing with responsibility. When you share with responsibility, there are certain rules and responsibilities that go with it. When there is free access, then everybody has the right to exploit it, or the free access that can just lead to unmanaged exploitation. So the two situations are not necessarily the same. Okay, so here we are looking at the rush hour on August 1st, 2007. The I-35 West Mississippi River Bridge collapsed, killing 13 people. You can see the collapsed bridge here. Federal inspection had ranked the bridge structurally deficient, like about 70,000 other bridges in the US. What happened? According to the prestigious American Society of Civil Engineers, our roads, dams, water systems, airports, and other infrastructure are in bad shape. These are typically built with public-private partnerships, and there are acceptable risks which the builders have to satisfy. Like the bridges, for example, cannot collapse at every little storm that comes by, but earthquake or massive hurricane may cause it to collapse, and then government is responsible for underwriting that risk and taking care of the repairs and so on. In their 2013 assessment, the ASCE gave the US infrastructure a D+, pretty bad grade, just above failure. In especially bad shape are the nation's levees and inland waterways. They both received a rating of D-. That's essentially a fail. What would the US need to do to get a better grade on the state of its infrastructure? The answer is that it would need to invest heavily in its infrastructure. In fact, the ASCE suggests that 3.6 trillion needs to be invested by 2020 to bring the US infrastructure up to good standards. So Joe Biden, now in 2022, I think 2021 or 22, managed to get a budget passed for a sort of an economic recovery post-COVID, which includes a lot of infrastructure investment. Will it be green? Will it create new employment? Will it be climate resilient? And so on are the questions. Recent tragedies caused by Hurricane Katrina in 2005 and Sandy in 2000, whatever it was, so Katrina hit New Orleans and the South Gulf of Mexico. Sandy hit New York, New Jersey. They illustrate the importance of investing in the maintenance of infrastructure and the consequences of not doing so. Libya got hit this time in the Mediterranean with the Medicane, and they had I think a couple of thousand people die. It's the responsibility of society at different levels, federal, state, and local, to make judgments about how much to invest in the infrastructure that we all share by increasing taxes or redirecting spending, and whether to reduce taxes, giving more resources to individuals to expend as they see fit. Will individuals voluntarily invest in building and maintaining critical infrastructure? People typically want lower taxes, but they also want governments to worry about infrastructure. For a wealth of information regarding the state of the US infrastructure and the challenges ahead, visit this website here, infrastructurepostcard.org, which is sounds like an NGO that tracks the tragedy. So, to quote John Haldane's book from 1968, therein is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit in a world that is limited. Ruin is the destination towards which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all. So this paper, according to this book by Andrees and Janssen, argues actually misrepresented the tragedy of the commons. It's really tragedy of open access. The metaphor used by Hardin, not Hadrin, sorry about that, John Hardin, is that he imagined a pasture that's shared for grazing by a number of herders, let's say, who can buy as many sheep as they want and graze over the land that is shared by all. So this is open access. There are no limitations. And the idea is that each man will buy as many sheep as possible till the pasture is not enough for anybody, and you end up with a tragedy of the common. But is this how the real world works? Not really. But Hardin's paper nonetheless became a paradigm for how global warming and environmental degradation have happened. So it started being applied to the shared resource of the atmosphere, where everybody is putting pollution, the ocean, where everybody is putting pollution, and suddenly you have the paradigm that looks like free access is actually what can cause tragedy of the commons. So what is the other paradigm? Who owns these resources? Is it shared by people and communities? Is it owned by the government? Is it owned by nobody? And so on. So that's what the book is going to build on. To quote more from the book, as we have hinted above, we will show in this book why Hardin's analysis was limited. Although we see resource collapses around the world, so that's tragedies of open access, we also see many success stories of long-lasting governance of shared resources, triumphs of the commons, which is what made Elinor Ostrom's work very unique and really a hope for the future. Open access situations are not always tragedies. Many times common property management regimes fail, as do private property and state-centric regulatory governance regimes. There are no panaceas, there is no silver bullet. The goal of this book is to illustrate a set of tools that can be used to determine what conditions make overexploitation more likely and what conditions are more likely to lead to the sustainable use of shared resources. So if you have tools and typographies which can be applied to different commons, then we have a way forward in managing sustainable exploitation of resources. The context, of course, is that if you look at what human beings have done, this is the relative biomass estimates from the beginning of industrialized fishing. So this is the biophysical context in which we will discuss the sustaining the commons in this book and this series of podcasts. So you're looking at different regions: tropical Atlantic, Indian, Pacific, Gulf of Thailand, St. Pierre Bank, and so on. And you're looking at catch per 100 hooks. So you're in some sense looking at catch per unit effort over the period of 1960 into 2000, so 1990s. And you basically see that every region has had catch per 100 hooks drop over time. Of course, this catch per unit effort or catch per 100 hooks is useful because it normalizes against number of increased hooks. Obviously, number of fishing boats and ships out there have increased, but you are looking at catch per unit effort. So it's not that each ship is catching less, it's that each hook itself is catching less, no matter how many hooks are being put out by each ship or how many ships are out there. So number of fish have dropped themselves by industrialized fishing and overexploitation, right? So this is obviously tragedy of the common because it is open access, right? And the idea of the commons themselves comes from the Middle Ages, where the shared properties were referred to as held in common. And when you talked about multiple held properties, you called them the commons, held in common. Okay, so this is how the system looked. Open field system, which actually was very intricate. In the open field system, peasants had private property rights to the grain they grew on multiple small strips of land that were scattered around the central village. So you in some sense had access to a piece of the common held in common. So you grew vegetables or grew grains and you owned that part. And then the non-growing season, there was grass or other pasture types or biomass that could be exploited for grazing. So you had grains and vegetables and you had cattle and livestock or sheep or whatever. So you could share the grazing, but there were responsibilities and rules associated with them. So however, during particular season, peasants were obliged to throw land open to all the landowners in a particular village so that they could all graze their sheep on the common land under the supervision of one herdsman. So it wasn't open access in that sense. The decision to convert the strips of privately used land into shared land for a period during each year was made by a village council. So there were rules. This enabled people to take advantage of economies of scale in grazing, as well as providing manure for their field, because the feces that the animals dropped was actually organic manure, that was fertilizer. And private incentives in grain growing, which lacks the important economics of scale and suffers from free riding when communal groups try to share labor inputs. So if you had shared labor to grow something over the whole land instead of cutting it into pieces, you would achieve some economy of scale. Of course, at some scale you would reach industrialized farming, and then monoculture and other things may come in. But the way it was done, you have divided the shared land into pieces where each one has a right to grow, and then after the growing season is over, you throw it open to achieve the economies of scale for grazing and fertilizing as a co-benefit. Okay, so let's leave this here after reading the summary. In summary, at the time Hardin wrote his now classic article, the work on collective action was rooted in rational choice theory, which will come back. A key assumption of this theory was that actors made rational or calculated decisions based on selfish motives alone, weighing individual costs and benefits, and not about how to make the entire piece of land provide maximum benefits for all the people sharing it. The implications for policy were clear. To avoid over-harvesting of shared resources, it was critical to establish private property rights or tax the use of the commons. Much work since has shown that this simply isn't the case. Okay, so there are alternatives in sustaining the commons and not necessarily over-exploiting them and leading to tragedies of the common. Triumph of the commons is possible as well. Okay, so we'll come back and continue the ideas in the next podcast. I think each chapter in the beginning will basically take one or two, each chapter will take one or two podcasts, but I'm obviously still being very brief, so you should definitely read this excellent book if you're interested in details and follow up on the references they provide. Okay.